More than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest ocean trench, northeast China contains clusters of volcanoes that should not be there if volcanism followed only the simplest rules of plate tectonics. One of them is Changbaishan, also known as Peak-to-Mountain, the volcano responsible for the enormous Millennium Eruption around 946 CE. Nearby volcanic fields such as Longgang and Jingpohu sit deep inside the Eurasian continent, far from the plate boundary where the Pacific Plate actually dives beneath Asia. For decades, scientists have tried to explain how magma reaches the surface so far inland. Now a new study has revealed a possible answer nearly 600 kilometers below the region. Instead of finding one cleanly broken tectonic plate, researchers found something stranger, a weakened, lens-shaped region inside the stagnant Pacific slab. It is not a completely open hole. It is more like a damaged section of plate that has become thin enough to redirect water-rich material upward. And directly above that weak zone and the edge of the slab sit two major clusters of volcanoes. The discovery changes a familiar picture of subduction. Usually when an oceanic plate reaches a continent, it bends downward into Earth's mantle. As it sinks, water locked inside minerals and sediments is released. That water lowers the melting temperature of the mantle above the slab, helping generate magma. This explains volcanic arcs such as Japan, the Andes, and the Cascades. But northeast China is different. The Pacific Plate enters the mantle thousands of kilometers to the east, beneath Japan and the western Pacific. Instead of continuing directly downward into the lower mantle everywhere, a huge section of that slab flattens out inside the mantle transition zone, roughly 410 to 660 kilometers beneath Earth's surface. Imagine pushing a carpet across a floor until its leading edge dives into a gap, then watching the rest of the carpet bunch up and lie almost horizontally underneath the room. That is roughly what has happened to part of the Pacific Plate beneath Northeast Asia. And sitting far above that buried slab are volcanoes. The question has always been how the two are connected. The new study, published in Nature Communications on August 15, 2026, approached the problem using earthquakes as a kind of planetary scanner. When seismic waves generated by distant earthquakes travel through Earth, some of their energy changes direction or converts from one type of wave into another when it crosses boundaries inside the mantle. Researchers can analyze those converted waves using a technique known as receiver function imaging. It is a little like medical ultrasound, except the signals come from earthquakes and the object being imaged is hundreds of kilometers beneath the ground. The team combined this seismic imaging with mineral physics calculations. That allowed them to estimate not only the shape of the buried slab, but also temperature, composition, and water content in the surrounding mantle. What emerged was not a smooth sheet of cold rock. The Pacific slab beneath northeast China is highly uneven. One section forms what the researchers describe as a drop-shaped penetration segment extending downward. Nearby sits a broad, lens-shaped weakened region. At first glance, that lens could look like a slab window, a complete tier through which hot mantle rises. But the seismic data suggest that is not what is happening. The plate appears damaged and strongly weakened, but not completely torn apart. Researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences describe it as essentially torn without being fully broken. That distinction matters because a classic slab window creates an obvious pathway for hot mantle to rise from below. If that were happening here, scientists would expect the mantle above the opening to be unusually hot. It is not. The new calculations place the potential temperature above the slab at about 1,649 Kelvin, roughly 1,376 degrees Celsius. That sounds extreme, but deep inside Earth it is close to normal mantle temperature. There was no giant plume of anomalously hot material. Instead, researchers found something else. Water. The mantle above the stagnant slab contains up to about 0.38 weight% water, along with an unusually large basaltic component of roughly 0.4 in the researchers' compositional model. In deep mantle terms, that is a significant enrichment, and it suggests that material carried down by the Pacific Plate is not simply trapped hundreds of kilometers below Asia. Some of it is coming back up. This is where the lens-shaped weak zone becomes important. The researchers calculated where upward transport from the slab should be strongest. The answer was not spread evenly across northeast China. The strongest upward flux was concentrated in two places, above the weakened slab lens and near the western edge of the stagnant slab. Then they compared those locations with the distribution of volcanoes at the surface. The match was striking. Those two deep zones sit beneath two major clusters of Cenozoic volcanism. So instead of a simple hot plume punching directly upward, the proposed process works more like focused recycling. The Pacific plate sinks into the mantle carrying basaltic ocean crust, sediments, and water-rich minerals. It then stalls in the transition zone. As the slab heats and deforms, water-rich and compositionally distinct material can separate from it. Because some of that material becomes less dense than the surrounding mantle, it begins rising. But the slab's internal structure determines where that ascent becomes concentrated. The weakened lens acts as one preferred pathway. The slab edge acts as another. Those focused upwellings can promote melting farther upward and help create volcanic clusters at the surface. In other words, the locations of volcanoes may be controlled by the shape of a tectonic plate that disappeared beneath Asia millions of years ago. This helps explain something that has puzzled geologists about Changbaishan for years. Changbaishan lies far from the modern subduction front, yet its magma contains chemical evidence of recycled materials associated with subduction. Scientists knew something from the Pacific slab was influencing it. They just did not agree on exactly how that material traveled back upward. Previous seismic studies found another remarkable feature beneath the same region. In 2025, researchers imaged a narrow tongue of the Pacific slab penetrating through the 660-kilometer boundary into the lower mantle. On both sides of this tongue, the slab remained flattened inside the transition zone. That geometry creates complicated pathways for mantle flow. The same study found that Changbaishan, Longgang, and Jingpohu all sit near this unusual slab structure. It also found a cluster of deep earthquakes between roughly 500 and 600 kilometers beneath the region, concentrated where the descending slab appears warped. So beneath northeast China, volcanoes at the surface and earthquakes hundreds of kilometers deep may be different expressions of the same enormous tectonic system. The slab is not simply sinking. It is flattening, bending, weakening, and locally penetrating deeper. And each of those changes affects how mantle material can move around it. Another 2026 study added an even larger piece to the puzzle. Researchers discovered an approximately 1,000-kilometer-long curved gap inside the stagnant slab beneath Northeast Asia. But surprisingly, that gap also showed no evidence of the extreme temperatures expected from a classic mantle plume. Its temperature was more than 200 degrees Celsius cooler than plume-like conditions. The researchers concluded that the gap was probably formed mechanically as the slab progressively tore during past reorganizations of plate boundaries, rather than being burned open by hot mantle. Together, these studies are replacing a relatively simple model with a much more complicated one. There is not necessarily one giant hole beneath Northeast Asia. There is a stagnant slab containing penetrations, edges, gaps, weakened regions, and compositional differences. And different parts of that structure can produce different types of mantle circulation. The newest research focuses especially on water. Water has an outsized effect inside the mantle. Even relatively small concentrations can lower the temperature required for rock to partially melt. That means you do not necessarily need an extremely hot plume to generate magma. You can instead change the chemistry of the mantle. Add enough water, and ordinary temperature mantle that would otherwise remain solid can begin producing melt. This may be one reason volcanism exists above the cold, stagnant Pacific slab. The volcanoes are not necessarily being powered by unusually high temperatures. They may be powered partly by unusually hydrated material rising from the slab. That is a fundamentally different mechanism. It also turns the volcanic system into part of Earth's deep recycling machine. Material begins at the ocean floor. The Pacific plate carries it downward. Some reaches hundreds of kilometers into the mantle. Part of it stalls. Water and basalt-rich components are later returned upward. Melting occurs. Magma rises through the crust. Eventually, material that once descended with an oceanic plate erupts again from volcanoes in continental Asia. This process can take millions of years. The new study calls it focused crustal recycling. And the word focused is important. If recycled material rose everywhere equally, scientists might expect diffuse volcanism spread across an enormous region. Instead, the slab appears to funnel the material toward particular zones. That could explain why volcanoes form clusters. The deep architecture selects where the surface activity becomes concentrated. The researchers also argue that northeast China may not be unique. Stagnant slabs exist beneath several regions around the western Pacific and elsewhere. If they also develop internal weak zones, lenses, edges, or penetration segments, similar focused recycling could influence intraplate volcanism in other parts of the world. There is still a major caution. This study explains long-term magma generation and volcanic distribution. It does not forecast an eruption at Changbaishan or any other volcano. Finding water-rich upwelling hundreds of kilometers below the surface does not mean magma is currently moving toward an eruption. The deep system controls the long-term supply of ingredients. Actual eruptions depend on processes much higher in the crust, including magma storage, pressure, gas, fractures, and interactions inside shallow reservoirs. But understanding the deep source matters because Changbaishan is not just another extinct volcanic field. Its Millennium Eruption around 946 to 947 CE was one of the largest eruptions of the last several thousand years. So discovering why such a large volcanic system exists so far from a conventional volcanic arc is more than an academic problem. And the answer now appears to lie in a place humans can never directly reach. Hundreds of kilometers below northeast China, the Pacific Plate has been lying almost horizontally inside the mantle for millions of years. It is cold compared with the surrounding Earth. It is deformed. It contains water and recycled oceanic material, and one part of it has weakened into a lens without completely breaking apart. That weak zone may be enough. Instead of allowing a giant plume of heat to rush upward, it appears to focus buoyant, water-rich material back toward the surface. Millions of years later, the result can be seen as clusters of volcanoes across northeast China. The volcanoes are visible. The structure controlling where they formed is buried nearly 600 kilometers below them, and only now are earthquake waves allowing scientists to see it.